On a tiny volcanic island lost in the Pacific Ocean, one of the fiercest and most controversial battles of World War II unfolded, where 21 square kilometers of ash became the price for saving thousands, a symbol of valor and a haunting question: was victory worth the blood it cost? In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, among waves and clouds, rises a small, seemingly unremarkable island, Iwo Jima. Just 21 square kilometers of volcanic ash, gray slopes, and toxic fumes. No rivers, no trees, not a single trace of comfort. But in 1944-45, this barren patch of land became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the history of American military strategy. To understand why, you have to look at the map and the numbers. If you're truly interested in these stories, please give a like and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to watch the video through to the end. Geography that dictated the war. By late 1944, the United States had seized control of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These became the launch pads for the heavy B-29 Superfortress bombers, designed to erase Japan's industrial and military infrastructure from the map. The problem: the distance from the bases to Japanese targets was around 2,400 to 2,500 kilometers one way, nearly the maximum range of a fully loaded B-29. Iwo Jima sat perfectly in between, roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, 1,200 kilometers from each. It wasn't just on the direct flight path of American raids, it obstructed them. The island hosted 3 Japanese airfields from which interceptor fighters launched. Early warning radar stations on Iwo Jima also gave Japan's air defense system critical time, often an hour or more, to prepare for incoming raids. This allowed the defenders to scramble fighters and ready anti-aircraft defenses well before the bombers arrived. The result was a brutal logistical paradox. To avoid Japanese fighters on Iwo Jima, B-29s often had to make a wide detour, known to pilots as the dogleg route, burning extra fuel and wasting time. Even then, they risked interception or being torn apart by flak. The B-29 and the limits of engineering. The Superfortress was a marvel of its time, a 4-engined giant that flew higher and farther than any other heavy bomber. But even marvels have limits. On a full fuel load with a full bomb payload, a B-29 had a range of about 5,200 kilometers, just enough to fly Marianas, Tokyo, Marianas. Any unexpected problem, headwinds, mechanical failure, or evasive maneuvering could leave crews stranded. Many didn't make it back, ending their missions in the Pacific. Fuel, weight, altitude, route, it all came down to an equation with no margin for error. The math was unforgiving. More bombs meant less fuel. Higher altitude meant higher fuel consumption. Any extra maneuver, any change in plan, and the bomber might not return. That's why the idea of creating a forward base halfway along the route wasn't just smart, it became essential. Iwo as the antithesis of freedom. But taking the island wasn't only about geography, it was also about eliminating a threat. Iwo's radar and airfields made it a kind of checkpoint in Japan's home defense system. Without neutralizing it, every B-29 raid followed a grimly predictable script: detected, intercepted, attacked, if lucky, bombed the target, then maybe made it home. With Iwo in American hands, crippled B-29s could land safely mid-route. Even more importantly, the island could host long-range escort fighters, something previously impossible due to distance. The P-51 Mustang, one of the best fighters of the war, couldn't fly to Japan and back from the Marianas, but from Iwo it could. That meant B-29s could finally have fighter protection over their targets and on their way home.
Not just protection, psychological relief. After months of flying solo through enemy skies, this was a game changer. Shorter track, greater survival, the math of staying alive. The real logistical challenge wasn't so much getting to Japan, it was getting back. Every mile added meant one less bomb or one less safety margin. Iwo Jima solved several problems at once. It shortened the bombing route by at least 400 kilometers, which meant more lives saved and more bombs dropped. It provided an emergency landing field. Over 2,400 B-29s used it due to damage or fuel shortage. It eliminated Japanese early warning radars, catching defenses off guard. It allowed stationing of escort fighters for protection, suppression, and sweeps. Logistically, it wasn't just a rock, it was a pressure valve. Capturing Iwo turned a desperate gamble into a controlled operation.
The island as an equation. Military planning often evokes maps and generals, but Iwo Jima was pure math. If a B-29 cost X, a crew Y, and each mission risked Z casualties, then every saved aircraft meant X plus Y units preserved, and another chance to win the war. Iwo became a variable in that equation, one that reduced loss and increased effectiveness. To the planners, it wasn't an island, it was a factor. To the pilots, it was a lifeline. To the Japanese, it was a final bastion. And to history, it was that scrap of volcano that helped change the sky over Tokyo. On the morning of February 19, 1945, American landing craft lined up along the shores of Iwo Jima like a scene from an ancient legend, the kind where the earth is about to split open. But here, there were no forests, no hills, not even grass. Only volcanic ash crunching under boots, gray smoke, and the relentless howl of Japanese artillery. The assault began, and it immediately became clear that this was not just another landing. It was a descent into a nightmare, orchestrated with surgical cruelty. The day ash turned into a meat grinder. The landing at Iwo Jima became the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific at that time, involving around 70,000 Marines and supporting troops. There had been heavy preparatory fire, 3 days of constant air raids, naval bombardment. But when the troops hit the beach, they weren't met by machine gun fire. The first moments were eerily quiet. And that was the trap. Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi knew that trying to stop the Americans on the beach was suicide. Instead, he let them advance inland before his troops, hidden in hills, caves, and tunnels, unleashed a storm of fire. The Marines were bogged down in the ash, which couldn't support weight, made digging cover impossible, and knocked men off their feet. Tanks stalled, vehicles were stuck, communications broke down. The entire battlefield became one massive kill zone. From the south, atop the dormant volcano Mount Suribachi, Japanese artillery fired with precision, as if from a theater box. Their observers saw everything. The Americans advanced mere meters per day. Every inch was paid for in blood.
The underground fortress. Kuribayashi had spent months preparing for this battle. What he built wasn't just a defense, it was a three-dimensional death trap. Across the island, a tunnel system stretched nearly 18 kilometers. Bunkers, artillery nests, ammo depots, field hospitals, all underground. Many strong points were connected, allowing soldiers to reappear suddenly behind advancing troops, escape incoming fire, or launch surprise counterattacks from nowhere. This was not a front-line defense, it was a defense everywhere, all at once. The fire positions were meticulously camouflaged. Some were built into caves, others disguised as rocks or mounds. From them came machine gun bursts, mortars, and grenades. Even when Americans took out a position, the defenders could return through tunnels or simply open fire from another angle. Japanese troops expected no rescue. Kurubayashi's orders were clear: no surrender, no wasteful banzai charges, but methodical destruction of as many enemies as possible. This tactic bewildered the Americans. It broke the patterns they were used to. Blood, numbers, and men. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, but psychologically, it lasted a lifetime. Marines recalled how the gray ash worked its way into their skin, their eyes, their weapons. It muffled sounds, but not fear. In that bleak grayness, everything blended: earth, corpses, smoke, sky. It was impossible to tell where the enemy was, or whether that rock was just a rock. The losses were staggering. The U.S. suffered around 6,800 killed and nearly 20,000 wounded. Of the approximately 22,000 Japanese defenders, more than 20,000 died, nearly all. Iwo Jima was a battle with almost no prisoners. Here's just one story. Sergeant John Basselon, already a hero of the Guadalcanal campaign, was killed on the first day of the landing while rescuing his comrades under fire. His death shocked even the most hardened veterans. If even guys like him die, no one's guaranteed to make it back, one said. Or Lieutenant Jack Liedl, who, despite severe injuries, continued leading his company until he died from blood loss. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, like many others on this island. Every patch of ground on Iwo Jima earned a nickname: Meat Grinder, Death Valley, Hellfire Ravine. There was no neutral zone, only death, dirt, and survival.
The flag above the volcano and the illusion of victory. On February 23rd, the fourth day of battle, a Marine reconnaissance team climbed to the top of Mount Suribachi. They raised the American flag. Below, the troops erupted, cheering, shouting, crying. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment, and his image became legend. 6 soldiers straining together to lift the flag, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, victory. And at the same time, a false sense of finale. Many thought the battle was over, but in truth, more than a month of deadly fighting remained. The island's northern half, riddled with caves and tunnels, was a true fortress. There, fighting was not for meters, but for inches. The final organized Japanese attack came on the night of March 26th. Over 300 soldiers emerged from the tunnels and assaulted an American airfield, killing another 53 men. The next morning, Iwo Jima was officially declared secured, but even then, survivors continued to crawl from tunnels, sometimes for weeks. The ash on which legend grew. Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice and heroism for the United States. For the Marines, it was a trauma that wouldn't let go. For historians, it became debate. Was the goal worth the cost? But for the soldiers themselves, the question was often more personal. If someone got home because of what we did, then maybe it was worth it. In a place with no trees, no water, no life, names remained. The name of every soldier, forever written into that gray, ashen shore. If, in the first chapter, Iwo Jima was a strategic point, here it becomes a place where geography stops being numbers and becomes blood. When the guns were still firing on Iwo Jima, when the ground still burned in gray ash clogged rifles and eyes, the first American bomber was already touching down on its volcanic soil. It was the B-29 Dinah Might, and its landing on March 4, 1945, wasn't just an aviation incident. It was the symbol of a new phase in the air war against Japan. Iwo Jima, wrested from the Pacific at the cost of thousands of lives, was finally fulfilling the role it had been taken for, saving others. Emergency landings. The island as an airborne lifesaver. Military planners had predicted an airfield on Iwo Jima could save hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. In reality, the numbers exceeded expectations. From spring 1945 to the end of the war, more than 2,400 B-29 Superfortress bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima.
With average crews of 10 to 11 men, that meant roughly 26,000 to 27,000 airmen were saved, spared from choosing between bailing into the ocean or dying for the lack of fuel. To the air crews, this wasn't just a runway. It was the last just in case. And it was for that in case that Iwo Jima had been stormed.
Stories that landed alive. Each landing was its own story. One crew was returning from a bombing run over Nagoya when flak tore open the tail. The navigator was killed, 2 gunners wounded. A few months earlier, they would have gone down over the Pacific, but now the pilot held it together just long enough to reach Iwo. Medics pulled the survivors from the wreck. A few weeks later, they were on their way home. Another case. A bomber that had its fuselage ripped apart made a belly landing. The landing gear wouldn't deploy. It skidded across the runway, hit a barrier, and burst into flames. And yet, most of the crew survived. Incidents like these happened almost daily. Dozens of fire crews and medics stood ready on Iwo for bad returns. In archival photos, you can see them, burned out B-29s, their skins ripped, noses blackened, standing shoulder to shoulder on the runway like ghosts, but ghosts that made it. P-51s from Iwo, escort that changed the game. But survival wasn't just about landing. It was also about getting there at all. Before Iwo Jima, B-29s flew alone over Japan with virtually no fighter escort. Fighters simply couldn't make the round trip. Their range was too short. That's why the arrival of P-51 Mustangs on Iwo marked a turning point. On April 7, 1945, 80 P-51s based on Iwo Jima escorted B-29s on a raid over Tokyo, the first of its kind. Agile, fast, and with excellent range, when launched from Iwo, they gave the Superfortresses what they had desperately lacked, a shield. On that first mission, the Mustangs shot down 21 Japanese planes and lost just one of their own. Statistically, small. Tactically, a breakthrough. By summer 1945, P-51s flying from Iwo had conducted about 1,700 sorties, escorting bombers and strafing enemy airfields. The very idea of deep escort missions had changed. B-29s were no longer alone. They flew under guard, with eyes and guns on their flanks. Many Mustang pilots called Iwo a base from hell. Heat, dust, primitive conditions, but they all knew their presence meant dozens of bomber crews would live. They didn't just protect aircraft, they protected the people who might not survive another mission. Combat efficiency. Numbers that speak for themselves. Once Iwo's airfield became operational, bombing effectiveness jumped. Here are just a few markers. February 1945, before capture. Bomb tonnage was low, missions were irregular, and losses were high. March 1945, after the airfield opened. Bomb tonnage increased nearly 11-fold. Escorts helped cut losses, more bombers came back, landings were safer. Why? Because now the B-29 crews had a choice. They could drop their bombs and fly back directly, no detours. They could load less fuel knowing they had a fallback field, and that meant more bombs could be carried. The paradox: the less fuel they took, the more ordnance they brought. The closer the rescue island, the greater the chance of taking that risk. And this wasn't just theory. It meant literally, one extra bomb equaled one less Japanese factory. One saved crew equaled 10 lives ready for the next mission.
When a runway became a lifeline. Former B-29 pilots often spoke of Iwo Jima with reverence. One wrote in his memoir, "We never saw who fought for that island, but every time our wheels touched down, we knew someone had died so we could live." In another story, after a brutal emergency landing, A crew carved a wooden cross beside the runway that read, "Thanks, brother, we made it home." Today, these numbers may seem like cold statistics. 2,500 landings, tens of thousands saved. But behind each one is a name, a family, a life. Behind each one, pain, relief, and a silent vow that the sacrifice wasn't in vain. Iwo Jima wasn't just a point on a map. It became a promise that not every mission had to end in the sea, that not every flight had to be a final one, and in that lies its true and priceless meaning. When the final shots on Iwo Jima fell silent in March 1945, the island was in American hands, but the cost of victory was staggering. Nearly 7,000 American lives were lost in the operation, and over 19,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties were even higher. Of the roughly 22,000 defenders, only a few hundred survived. In terms of numbers, it was one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the Marine Corps. But was it justified? From a military standpoint, Iwo Jima was meant to be a key, and its capture did indeed change the course of the air campaign against Japan. Yet debates about its cost and necessity continue to this day. Command calculations, the math of sacrifice and rescue. Military planners based the operation on concrete numbers. According to estimates, more than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima after bombing runs over Japan. Each aircraft had about 10 or 11 crew members. That means roughly 27,000 American airmen were saved thanks to the island's airfield. Compare that to the 6,800 Americans killed in the ground operation. That gives you a ratio of about 4 lives saved for 1 lost. This became a central argument in the official American justification for the battle. Yes, it was costly, but without it, the loss might have been even greater. Admiral Nimitz famously remarked, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue on Iwo Jima." And that was not just a tribute, but an acknowledgement that the losses had been understood and accepted as part of the strategic price. From that point of view, Iwo Jima fulfilled its purpose. It provided a critical emergency landing site, gave B-29 crews a chance to make it home, and saved thousands. Efficiency gains, payloads, routes, and escorts. Beyond saving lives, Iwo Jima significantly increased the efficiency of the entire bombing campaign. Previously, B-29s were weighed down with extra fuel and forced to take detours to avoid Japanese radar and fighter bases on Iwo Jima. These doglegs added hundreds of kilometers, burned thousands of liters of fuel, and frayed the nerves of air crews. Once Iwo was captured, bombing runs became shorter, straighter, and safer. B-29s could now carry less fuel and more bombs, rely on a nearby emergency landing field, receive fighter escort from P-51s based on the island. As a result, by March 1945, with Iwo operational, the tonnage of bombs dropped increased 11-fold compared to February. Missions became more regular, predictable, and survivable.
In short, Iwo Jima became a logistical and tactical amplifier for the air war. Once it came online, the bombing campaign against Japan shifted into a higher gear. Controversial arguments. Could it have been avoided? But if the case for Iwo seems so strong, why is it still debated? Some historians and veterans argue that the island was not the only option. For example, Japan's air power was declining. By early 1945, Japanese interceptors were already far less effective. Numbers were shrinking, pilots were poorly trained, and fuel supplies were running out. Was the threat already fading? Alternatives existed. Rescue submarines, air-sea recovery missions, and other emergency plans were improving. Could the United States have invested more in these systems instead of launching a full invasion? Okinawa and other islands could have served similar purposes within a few months, should the operation have been delayed to avoid such high casualties. Fighter escorts were helpful, but by mid-1945, U.S. air superiority was already overwhelming. Was Iwo's role still crucial? Critics argued that Iwo Jima was a blunt solution to a flexible problem. In other words, the cost was out of proportion with what the battlefield had become. The generals' calculations and what they missed. For American commanders during World War II, the decision was brutal. Secure crew survival, increase bombing power, and blind Japan by removing its radar and early warning positions. Based on the data they had, the decision made sense. But history likes uncomfortable questions. Generals couldn't have predicted how quickly Japan's air defenses would collapse. They couldn't have known that many B-29 crews might have made it back to the Marianas or used other rescue options. Some analysts claim that as many as half the bombers could have returned even while damaged without the need for Iwo. And the moral factor wasn't always counted. Iwo Jima became a symbol. But behind that symbol was a deep scar. Thousands of deaths. Countless wounded veterans, not just in body, but in mind. Some things can't be calculated on a strategy map. In conclusion, the operation did improve the bombing campaign. It did save lives. It did expand bombing capacity. It did make routes safer. But was it worth the price? Seen through the eyes of the generals in 1945? Yes. Seen through the eyes of soldiers dying on that beach of ash? The answer is harder. History doesn't always give us neat resolutions, especially when the cost is human. Perhaps, as one veteran said, we didn't need to prove it was worth it. We just did what we were ordered. Let someone else do the counting.
When the last shots on Iwo Jima fell silent in March 1945, the island was in American hands. But the story of Iwo Jima didn't end there. It began again, not as a military operation, but as a symbol. That harsh volcanic shore, the site of the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, quickly became a metaphor of courage, sacrifice, and victory. Nearly 80 years have passed since then, but the image of Iwo Jima has not faded. It has become an icon, a subject of debate, a piece of national memory, and a focal point increasingly viewed through a new lens. Immediately after the war, Iwo Jima as triumph. After Japan's surrender in September 1945, Iwo Jima took a firm place in military reports and ceremonial speeches. Veterans returned home, many of whom had fought for this barren island or were saved because of the airfield built upon it. Newspapers, magazines, and documentaries hailed Iwo as the key to victory, the gateway to Tokyo, the island worth dying for. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of 6 Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an instant classic. It was reprinted in newspapers, on war bond posters, and in schoolbooks. In 1954, it was immortalized in granite and bronze, the iconic Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, where annual ceremonies are still held today. For an entire generation, Iwo Jima was not just a battle, it was a national symbol. A nation that could suffer, triumph, and remember. It entered the realms of cinema, literature, and the military brotherhood's culture. For Marines, it became sacred ground. The 21st century, a new wave of critique and doubt. But over time, as archives opened, veterans passed, and historians gained access to new sources, a reevaluation began. Not because anyone sought to tarnish the memory, but because history is not only about heroism, it's about analysis. In the early 2000s, more critical scholarship emerged. One of the most prominent voices was historian Robert Burrell, Marine veteran and academic.
In his publications, he argued that the idea of Iwo Jima being essential to the success of the strategic bombing campaign was based on exaggeration. He noted that many B-29s that landed on the island could have made it back to the Marianas. The Japanese air defenses were already weakening by the time the island was seized. That the cost, thousands of lives, vast resources, was disproportionate to the outcome. Another question raised, was the airfield truly decisive for the bombing campaign? By the time it became fully operational, Japan was already losing control of its airspace, industry, and fleet. This raises the uncomfortable possibility, was this a victory for victory's sake? These critiques aren't aimed at the soldiers. On the contrary, they mostly question command decisions and the logic of cost versus benefit. But they encourage us to view the battle not just through the lens of memory, but through cold-eyed historical scrutiny. Veterans, between pride and pain. And what about those who were there? The answers are not simple. For some, Iwo Jima was hell, but a necessary one. They believed and still believe that their sacrifice was justified. In their eyes, it wasn't a political issue, it was personal. They saw B-29s land. They heard engines roar overhead when damaged planes returned from hell. To them, the arguments of armchair historians feel distant from reality. But others had doubts. Some described Iwo Jima as a trap they were pulled too deeply into, that the command underestimated Japanese defenses, that the real effect didn't justify what they endured. One veteran interviewed in the 1990s said, "If we saved even one guy from a B-29, maybe it was worth it. But if not, I wish I could have my friends back." In other words, even among the survivors, there was no consensus. Everyone had their own Iwo Jima. For some, pride. For others, a scar. For many, a memory too painful to unearth.
Iwo Jima as a symbol. What remains? Today, Iwo Jima is more than an island. It's a site of pilgrimage. Every few years, delegations arrive. American veterans, Japanese officials, journalists. They gather at memorials, exchange gestures of reconciliation. The language spoken there is not about tactics, but about sacrifice. The Arlington Memorial still stands. The flag atop Suribachi remains part of national iconography. But at the same time, younger generations often encounter Iwo Jima through the lens of critical reinterpretation. For instance, in 2006, Clint Eastwood released 2 films, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, showing the battle from both American and Japanese perspectives. It was a step toward recognizing that Iwo Jima was not just a story of American valor, but a shared tragedy. The island has become a complicated symbol. It is no longer seen solely as unquestioned heroism. It is also a reminder, even in a just war, some decisions come at a terrible price. Memory that must be carried and re-examined. Iwo Jima remains at the heart of American memory, both as a place of glory and as a wound. It teaches us that behind every victory lie names, stories, and pain. That even a frozen moment, the photo of the flag, doesn't reveal what it cost to reach that summit. But history must not stand still. The more archives open, the more voices we hear, the more complete the picture becomes. And so the memory of Iwo Jima must remain alive, not only solemn, but honest, not only in myth, but a study, so we don't just remember, we understand.